So there's something real dirty going on. And thank God it is not it's not an SBC sex abuse crisis. But there is a crisis going on of abuse in the SBC. It just happens to be abuse of power.
Podcast. I'm excited for today's episode with Kyle Whitt. But before I get there, I would like to say a word from our sponsors. One of our sponsors is Fund of the Nations. Fund of the Nations helps individuals, organizations, and churches raise money for missions, adoptions, and nonprofits by custom designing high-quality, low-cost t-shirts and other apparel to use for fundraising. They have great custom design work and incredible customer service. Everyone wears t-shirts, so give them one that helps you accomplish your calling. At Fund of the Nations, they always say, money shouldn't determine your vision, just fund it. With no money required up front. It's a no-risk fundraiser. So get $20 off your first order by using the code CROSSROADS when you contact them. Let Fund the Nations help you fulfill your calling. And second, if you are a regular listener to this podcast, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. You know, we're seeking to help you think through the truth, defend the truth, and speak it in love. And as I think about you as a listener, I'd like to ask you just one thing. If you have enjoyed this podcast, there's a couple things you can do to spread the reach of this podcast. Obviously, the reach of podcast is largely contingent upon listeners like you. So a number of things you can do. First, you can subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use, such as Apple, Spotify, YouTube. And that will make sure you receive notifications when a new episode comes online. But also you can go onto Apple or Spotify and give the podcast a rating. A 5-star rating would obviously help if you think it's that much, but if not, any rating would be appreciated. The more ratings on Apple Podcasts, the more visibility for the podcast. And lastly, it'd be helpful if you shared this podcast on social media, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. So thank you so much for being a regular listener, and we hope this episode will edify you and help you think through important issues of our day. Let's dive in. So Kyle, how are you, man?
I'm doing pretty good, and I'm appreciative to be on here and looking forward to a good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Kyle Whitt, man, I first heard about you through a video that came out about your experience with NAM, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But also, you've done some really great work following the Sex Abuse Task Force recommendation report, which will be the subject of our podcast today. So we're excited to really crunch the numbers and look at the numbers. You know, math is objective. So I'm excited to see the objectivity kind of come out of this. And I think people often will spin and give their subjective opinions. But I think when we really dive down and examine these things, I think you have something to offer for our listeners today to think through this biblically. And so I really appreciate that. Kyle, why don't you start this podcast by sharing just a little bit about yourself, how you came to know Christ, and where you live, what you do?
Okay, well, if you ask my sister, I came to Christ at 5 years old in our camper trailer one night, praying with her. I did not. I can guarantee I did not. I did not understand the basics. Coming to Christ was about getting something. It was about, if you pray this prayer, you get to go to heaven. You get something. I had no understanding of sin. I had no understanding about salvation. I had no understanding about what the gospel really was. I didn't even understand that Christ died for me. So I know I wasn't saved. But that put me in a false sense of security. And I went to church, children's church, growing up, go to a Christian school, go to youth group, leader in youth group, all these things. But one thing was shockingly lacking, which was the preaching of the gospel. Again, the gospel still, it never developed any of those places beyond Christ died for you. And if you accept that, you get to go to heaven. It was very basic and it was very self-centered. It was about me. Luckily, at the high school I went to, Christian high school, there was one teacher who, I mean, it is his mission. No kid is escaping his class without having the gospel drilled into their head. He broke it down into 10 gospel truths. He had a diagram for it. Every class, even if it wasn't directly related, was going to get that and have it burrowed into their head. It was finally through that and through other classes of his that it finally broke through to me. And I remember this clearly. The world didn't make any sense to me. I was saved, yet I felt miserable. I knew Christ, but the world was dark and hopeless. I was living in this contradiction, and finally one night, just miserable, just depressed, just feeling awful, I got up from my desk and was walking to my bed to go to sleep. And I just remember thinking in my mind, this has to be the last night. Something has to change. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but it didn't mean anything positive. It was about giving up. I don't know exactly in the moment what I thought giving up meant. But luckily, Christ had a different plan for what that meant. And it was just like the truth of the gospel that was being drilled into my head finally broke through, and I just collapsed. I remember that, just absolutely collapsing, slamming into the side of my bed, and just an overwhelming sense of just surrender. And just, I didn't pray any special prayer. I don't remember I don't think I even said or really even thought anything. It was more of just an understanding and a surrendering. And yeah, that was the last night. Something did change, and that was the gospel. That was coming to Christ. That was surrendering myself, finally giving up that selfishness, finally giving up that living for myself, although that's something we all struggle with, and we will always struggle with. But
yeah,
that was the story of me coming to Christ, and that was at the age of 16. And then a long, long journey. God put me through a lot of situations after that, and a lot of things that kind of put me in a state where I was just like shell-shocked, and took a long time to process it. But God was good and used all of these things to then build me up. And skipping forward a decade or more, moving towards ministry, I eventually came to a point where I started a journey of church planting. And initially, so I grew up in a Baptist church, but it wasn't Southern Baptist.
Okay.
In fact, I think the nearest Southern Baptist church to us was over a half hour away.
Okay.
Living up in Washington State. There aren't many. It was at the time, Baptist General Conference. Now they're called Converge. I was originally going to go with them, and I was contacting their church planning arm in a bunch of different ways. No contact, could not get a response back. And I went, you know what? My brother-in-law helped with the Southern Baptist church plant. I have a lot of respect for Southern Baptists. I have respect for their organization. Let's see what information they have, because they probably got a lot of good information. Long story short, I accidentally submitted a request to become a church planner and got called within an hour. They said, "Wow, hey, yeah, you want some information? We'll get you some information. The local guy from your area will call you probably in a couple days." Hang up the phone. Within an hour, that local guy calls me.
Wow.
And the first thing he says, "We've been looking for a church planner in Gig Harbor."
Yeah.
And it was kind of that moment that it clicked in my mind, like, okay, I think something's going on. I'm a thick-headed, stubborn man, but I think I'm grasping where God is leading this.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't realize the journey that God was taking me on was not the journey that I thought I was going to be going on.
Yeah.
And he had a different purpose for why I was involved with Southern Baptist Church planning. But where I'm at now, due to a multitude of factors, me and my family now live in northern Idaho, and we're continuing ministry. I am working at a local Southern Baptist church here, and we're doing a lot of different ministry work, and we're working towards organically planting. And by that, I mean using the people we already have that live in all the tiny little nothing towns that no one knows exists to, over time, using qualified men, plant little congregations and spin them off into autonomous churches in all these little nothing towns that no one knows exists. So still in the world of church planning, just in a different way. Still in ministry, just in a different way.
Yeah.
And I've also been working to call out the infiltration of liberalism, of woke ideologies into the church, both in the SBC, but also in wider American Christianity. So I've been busy.
Yeah. Yeah.
God's
Absolutely.
brought me on a journey, to say the least.
And, you know, for those who are listening, I'm going to link Kyle's video that he did when he came out, it telling more of an experience about some of the problems he's seen within the SBC, being on the inside as someone who was paid by the SBC and supported. So you'll definitely want to.
Well, I should correct that. I never actually got to the point where I was receiving any money from them.
Okay, cool.
And I got to a point pretty early on that I was not going to take any money because of the issues that I was seeing.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Well, yeah, they'll definitely want to watch that though to get more of the background. So I'll definitely link that below. But thank you for that correction. I do appreciate that. So excited to hear about your work though that you're doing in Idaho. And you know, I was actually in Idaho sort of last summer. I mean, I was technically, but last summer I was up at Utah, reaching Mormons, you know, evangelizing Mormons. But we went to Bear Lake, and to go around the north of that lake, you got to go through Idaho because the lake is in both Idaho and Utah. And so that was pretty neat. But a beautiful, beautiful place and lots of lostness there. So definitely be praying for your work there and excited to hear that you're up there. But thank you so much for your courage once again and for standing for the truth. And so just shifting gears a little bit from your story to some of your more recent work, you know, I would like to really show our audience specifically how you've crunched these numbers on the sex abuse, and I'm going to put in air quotes, crisis in the SBC. And I think your work has been super helpful. I read through the whole PowerPoint slide and just think it's fantastic, and really would just like to see you do a presentation on that in just a really brief, helpful way to help our audience see, okay, why it's not really a crisis.
Yeah. So this is such a complicated issue to talk about because you have to be very particular and accurate.
Yes.
Is there sex abuse within the SBC? Yes. No one is denying that.
Correct.
Is it a crisis? Well, all sin is a crisis. Any sin in the church is a crisis. God made that pretty darn clear with Ananias and Sapphira, what his expectations for his church are.
Right.
Is it a crisis in the sense of this, you know, emergency, that it's so much larger? It's this, you know, big, monstrous, growing issue. That is what I'm specifically interested in.
Okay.
The narrative that's been woven by, and I'm willing to call them what they are, by liberal people within the SBC. Is their narrative true? And so at the request of a friend, I crunched some of the numbers, and then eventually I turned this into a little PowerPoint based specifically on a confrontation that happened on the floor of the convention this year in Anaheim with the head of the this sex abuse task force, Bruce Frank, and his confrontation with Mark Coppinger. Talking about Bruce Frank, he made several claims and he threw out numbers. So, and going to this little PowerPoint I made, I'm just did a quick look at the numbers, and the question is, was Bruce Frank justified in the numbers he was using and what he was saying, or was he being a bully? So I'll run through this real quick and try and just highlight the more important things. And then I think I've already shared the PowerPoint with you in a way that you have access to it, that you could give it to other people.
Right.
If I haven't, I'll make sure you have that.
Thank you.
So that people can have this, because there are links in it. I tried to cite my sources. But let's look at Bruce Frank's primary claims. Again, and these claims coming from the man who headed up the task force, these are the claims of the task force. He is representing them. They're also in writing in different places. So what he claims is all studies agree that only 3% of abusers are convicted. He claimed that there were 400 abusers on the list. And for those who aren't aware, there was a list compiled over a series of years by a staff member of the executive committee documenting sex abuse. And I'll put that hyper in quotes for this, because we'll see that in a second what this list actually is, but documenting sex abuse. He said there were 400 sex abusers on this list. He says since there are 400 is only 3% of the total abusers, then this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there is a huge problem. Therefore, we must redo the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention. That is a direct quote from him. Redo the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention. I didn't put it in quotes because I reformatted it for this bullet point, but he did actually say that we must redo the structure of the Southern Baptist Convention. So a very bold claim.
Yeah.
So let's examine his numbers. First, the 3% number he's getting is convictions. From his source. Again, I'm being generous to him. I'm using his sources, his numbers, and being as conservative and generous as I possibly can with all of this. My numbers are not necessarily more accurate than his. I'm just drawing out his logical conclusions. So the 3% number is convictions. So how many convictions, confessions, etc., are on the list? Again, I was generous using confessions. Not all of those were legal confessions. There were 329, roughly, guilty on the list. For perspective, we'll use three numbers. We'll use the 3% he did for cases that result in a guilty verdict, and there's even complications on that. Everything of his has that asterisk next to it. But this 3% number, it assumes that even the dismissed cases, those that were found innocent, it assumes those in its number that they're guilty. It also estimates that only 1/3 of cases are reported. That number goes up dramatically, up and down dramatically year to year, because it's an estimation. You can't get an exact number on that. And it assumes that all of those are legitimate cases. It assumes no false reporting. Then let's take 8%. 8% of reported cases end in conviction. So that is again, using the source he quoted, 8%, from that source, 8% of cases end in a conviction. This does not assume unreported cases. But it's still assumes that even the guilty or even the innocent are actually guilty. And then we'll just take another one for perspective of 15%. This is a complete unscientific estimation that I just put together for perspective that assumes that some cases are unreported, assumes that some cases are falsely reported, and assumes that there are some unreported cases, but not a ton. Again, just to get perspective, so we can see a range. What does this look like? So using his number, how many abusers would there be in the SBC? Now, again, another asterisk, the guidepost report was only supposed to go back 20 years. The list went back much further than that. But we'll take the past 30 years. We'll give, since cases from the 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, and 40s, yes, it went back that far, were much, much lower. We'll just say past 30 years.
Can I ask a quick question, actually?
That would, yeah, go ahead.
So I'll try to do as little of this as possible because I want the flow to go. But you said the guidepost report was only supposed to go back 20 years. Was that something that the messenger said that is only as far back as it should go? Like they voted, this is what needs to happen? Or was that like an executive committee move? And then in follow up to that question, why, if there is any knowledge out there, why did they go back even further?
So, and this is where things get hyper complicated because the SBC is complicated in general, but this whole situation is super complicated. As far as who set the parameters of the time frame, I don't think that was something the messengers voted on.
Okay.
But I can't give you a 100% on that.
That's fine.
But I don't remember that being part of what was voted on.
Because that's just a question
From
of
what I
integrity.
remember,
not for you, but for them is my point.
Yeah.
Is if they say, hey, this is what we voted on, and then they go beyond that, it's almost like they're grasping for straws in a way.
Well, it was set out as a parameter. In the guidepost report, it was set out, whether that was set by the messengers, the executive committee, or guideposts themselves.
Okay.
Somewhere in that, they set that as the official time frame. We're only going back to 2000. I think there were some reasons with that with the executive committee, based on some reporting. But then the list that the executive committee had that we're kind of talking about, that went back much further because it was not part of this. It was not part of the scope. It was not, well, we'll talk about the list as we go along. But we have our three numbers, 3%, 8%, 15%. That gives us, within the SBC, over the course of 30 years, somewhere between 11,000 abusers and 2,200 abusers. So those are numbers. The SBC is pretty darn large. So are those gigantic numbers? Let's get percentages. And then let's get something to compare that percentage to. So how many people were in SBC ministry? Why I say ministries, because the list includes pastors, deacons, piano players, volunteers, SBC ordained people that don't necessarily seem to be in the SBC, Baptist schools, staff and students, Baptist camps, seminary students. It included an accountant, a contracted accountant that wasn't part of an SBC church. So it's broad. So I had to come up with a number without just using the entire SBC population. Let's get an estimate, a rough estimate of how many people fit that definition of in ministry that the list used. So over 30 years, a conservative estimate, there were 2 million people in SBC ministry. Now, if anyone wants to know why I came up with that number, it's in the end of the presentation. This is out of a total SBC membership over that 30 years of something between 30 and 35 million. Again, the Guidepost report was only supposed to go back to 2000, but the list, which is what Bruce Frank was referring to, goes back much further. So percentage-wise, we had something, raw numbers, 11,000 to 2,200. What percent of the SBC of people in ministry over 30 years is that? Well, it's something between 0.55 to 0.11%. For perspective, is that high? Is that low? Where does that land? Let's get something to compare it to. Let's compare it to the US population. Okay. Now, this is where it's going to get crazy generous for Bruce. This number is going to end up being very conservative by Bruce's standards. So for this, we'll go off the number of registered sex offenders. Why am I going off the number of registered sex offenders? Because not all, you can't just get a number of sex abuse in the United States. They're tracked under different categories of crimes, and not all of them get you on the sex offender registry. And another interesting fact, most people are only on the sex offender registry for 10 or 20 years. So a lot of people have fallen off of this number as well. So this is only capturing a small portion of sex crimes and only a portion of the people over 30 years that have committed those, have been on the registries. Beyond the fact that a lot of the registries didn't even start until the early 90s and then took some time to get going. So again, being very generous to Bruce here. Currently, there's something like 800,000. For our purposes, just be, again, generous, we'll take 750,000. Okay. We're only going to go back 20 years, again, because people are only on the list for 10 to 20 years, mostly. So we'll just try and be a little bit fair. The U.S. population for that time is about 340 million people. That's because we're not going to count anyone under the age of about 9, currently 9. So that takes off 40 million. And there's been about 50 million deaths. So about 340 million people. Okay, so just skipping straight to the percentage. If 3% of cases result in, or 3% of sex abuse results in a conviction, not cases, just abuse in general, then 7.35% of the U.S. population is guilty of sex abuse. And this is only people that have been on the sex offender registry, and even then it was being generous because many people have been removed from that over the past 20 years. If we use the 8% number, which is just cases that result in conviction, that's 2.76%. And then our comparative number of 15%, 1.47%. So compared to the SBC, now I know some people are going to be listening to this and not seeing this. Please grab the PowerPoint so you can visually see
insanely
this.
Different.
Because, just hearing that it's 0.55% versus 7.35%, we can see that sounds huge. Visualizing it, my goodness. So by Bruce Frank's standards, his standards, again, these are not perfect scientific numbers. These are just using numbers to compare his assertion against his own numbers. So observations from that. And this is where it really kind of comes to some meat and potatoes. There's a 14 times difference between the SBC and the US. And again, that's using very conservative numbers on both sides. But let's say my numbers are off by a factor of 2 on both sides. So there's half as many in the US and double the number in the SBC. There'd still be a huge gap between the SBC and the US. We'd still be doing dramatically better than the US average. And again, for at least the US, we know that the number I used is much smaller than the number of convicted abusers. Bruce Frank's iceberg is an ice cube compared to the US average. It's so much smaller. Now here's another thing. And this is very important. Bruce Frank knew that there were not 400. Again, the number he used, he said there were 400 abusers on this list. That was his central premise to bash Mark Coppinger and to bash the beat over the heads with this number, the messengers. He knew there were not 400. And for anyone that wants to be pedantic, it's 409. He's not lying by saying 400 rather than 409. He was just being quick. But he was lying because he knew that there were not 400 on the list. He was the head of the task force. They released this list redacted to the public, and they had to say in that release that there were innocent people on it.
Wow.
He knew that there were acquitted people. He knew that there were people. He knew that there were people convicted of non-sex crimes. And I'll highlight that in just a second. But Dr. Frank and I'm going to lay it at the whole task force. They were bullies. They are and they were bullies. They bullied the messengers to get something passed with false information. They were willing to lie to push forward a narrative. And again, in Bruce Frank's words, redo the structure of the SBC.
That sounds really creepy.
He said something out loud he shouldn't have said. Yeah! He said, we have an agenda. Now, it should scare people when they're willing to lie for their agenda. It should also make it very clear. If the whole Tom and Jennifer Buck situation did not make it clear, this lying, the task force lying, should make it clear that this is not about helping victims. And so many people just did not do their due diligence, just heard the claims, and then voted for reforms that are essentially making the SBC a denomination because they went, we have to help the victims. But you're not helping victims when you're lying. You're not helping victims. The analogy I'll use is when some big tragedy happens, there's an accident or something happens and, many people die. There's a lot of emotionalism and people capitalize on that to get something pushed through. I have got pushback before when, there's a major infrastructure accident or something, a bridge collapses or, boat capsizes and people die or something like that. And I go, how did this happen? And I ask questions and people get upset. You're disrespecting the memory of the people that died. How am I disrespecting them? I want to know the truth. Only the truth will help make change to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Their attitude is the opposite. We're going to lie. We're going to inflate things. That's scary. That's abusive. That is abusive. They are abusing people. They are abusing the SBC membership. They're abusing the messengers. They are abusing legitimate victims
really
of
to
sex
speak to that
abuse.
point there, I think you're absolutely right. I think even if we were to try to give them the benefit of the doubt here, thinking maybe they're ignorant, right? We might some people might want to do that. They might be pushing back against you and saying, Kyle, maybe they're just hearing the numbers, they're getting the report from Guidepost, and there's all this pressure, like you're saying, there's all this crisis emotionalism. What would you say to someone who's just trying to give them benefit of the doubt? Someone who's saying they're not acting nefariously. Like, how would you respond to that?
I would respond with this. It is called my citations.
Look at the evidence.
I cite their claims. You can look at it. There's citations for where he gets his 3% number. There's citations for the only 1/3 get reported claim. There's citations about jailing data. There's again, all of this that they used, that he used. This comes from them. I found it on their frequently asked questions. I found their sources, and it's linked. There's the release of the list that clarifies that the list contained entries that do not relate to sexual abuse or that resulted in an acquittal, which were supposed to be redacted. Not all of them were. In a few facts about the list, we discovered that there were unredacted entries that do not relate to sex abuse. And I'll go back to that in a second. Yeah. And then there's my math. But, and there's even my email. You can go email me. I'm open to things. But that's what I would say is go look at their claims. You can go. They made it clear that they know that there were innocent people on the list. When he said the 400 number, he can't hide behind that. The numbers he was using for his claims, I will dispute them because they themselves clarified that this is not. He referred to the 3% number as a study. It's not a study. The source that he gets it from even clarifies that it's not a study. That it is a combining information from several federal government reports because it combines data from studies. Again, so it's not a study, it's combining studies with different methodologies. It is an approximation, not a scientific estimate. Yet he got up there and boldly claimed that all studies claim that only 3% result in conviction. What's worse than this is that number, even if we give him that number, even though the sources
don't even support it,
use it the way he does. Beyond that, that is only for violent sex crimes, sexual assault. That is for rape and sexual assault.
Okay.
Only. Not all sexual abuse. So even there, he's abusing the number. But, and I'll make this the last thing. What are a few things from the infamous list? Which is, to clarify what this list is. I think it was in 2006, Augie Bodo commissioned a staff member to begin collecting reports of sex abuse, not reports from SBC churches, but news reports, and to see if there was or wasn't, what was the scale of things. So it was Google searching is what we're talking about. Google searching for news reports. And even then, the person did a terrible job at that. But let's look at, again, this was used as evidence in the Guidepost report. Facts from this list have been posted in news outlets all over the place. Christian outlets have used this as information, both liberal and conservative sides. There's one person I really want to call out by name, but I'm not going to do that right now. But let's look at a couple things. The oldest case on there was from 1949. Now, the person labeled it as a 1947. I looked at the case. It was from 1949. It did involve reoffense later, and it was listed as an SBC church because there was more than SBC on there. So I literally had to go through over 700 cases and look at the SBC ones to get the actual numbers. But anyway, this old one that was listed as SBC, they left the SBC in the 60s. I didn't include that in my number of convicted cases. Also because it never resulted in conviction. The guy died before a case was ever adjudicated. So there's kind of two strikes against using it as a number of SBC abusers. 4 pastors were on the list for not reporting abuse. That's bad, but they're not abusers, sex abusers. Yeah. No. And Bruce Frank used them as part of his 400. One man was on there for not informing his congregation of a sex offender. It didn't clarify what that meant, whether that was someone was convicted in the church and he didn't tell the people, or a sex offender joined the congregation. But that's it's
ambiguous.
I have no idea why that's on there. 2 cases of adultery, just straight up, by admission, adultery, not sex abuse. Even on the list, it's clarified. Now, there are other ones that are probably adultery on the list, but I was generous. But these ones were very clear, no sex abuse. Now, one of the guys did try and kill the mistress.
Yeah,
but that's not sex
attempted
abuse.
Murder.
And again, these were just, yeah. There are 2 that were guilty of soliciting prostitutes. Again, that's a sexual sin, but that's not sex abuse in the way that, we're kind of looking at it. One man was on the list for having his pants down in an adult bookstore. Again, sexual sin, but not sex abuse. One pastor was caught in a strip club. Again, sin, but not sexual abuse. But the weird one about that is, who caught him there?
Yeah.
Who caught it? Who went in and was like, "Hey, Pastor Greg, what are you doing here?"
It's like, that's awkward.
There was 2 cases of child abuse on the list. Now, one is super complicated because there's claims of sex abuse, but then the conviction was overturned, and the facts in the trial are really weird, so I didn't include that one. They tried to use him spanking kids bare bottom as like establishing that he had a desire to sexually abuse children. So I was like, okay, this one is not actually at conviction. Right. We're going to not touch that. 2 cases of domestic violence, no sex abuse at all, just domestic violence. And these are unredacted ones. The list has a bunch of redactions on it. These are unredacted. There was a case of kidnapping and bank robbery on a list of sex abuse. At least 4 that were listed as SBC were definitively not SBC. At least 6 that were listed as SBC, I could not find a single connection to the SBC. I still included them in my number. Again, being generous to them. I included them because maybe there was a connection that was not known, but there just wasn't any. Not on the list, not in my research. 2 men were ordained SBC, but there was no connection anywhere to the SBC. So SBC seminary grads, I don't know. 1 man claimed to be part of an SBC church, but he was just a contracted accountant. And there's some complication to that one, but the biggest thing is there's no corroboration of him being part of the church. There's a ex-employee of the church that said he was, but they gave a completely conflicting account than what the accused man gave. The accused man said he was involved in the church one way. The former staff member said he was involved in a completely different way. So I'm going to trust the church because there's no corroboration that he was involved. There was also, last one, A professor from Liberty University was included on the list as an SBC, as part of the SBC, because Liberty has a partnership with the Southern Baptist Conservatives of Virginia.
Yep.
It's not an SBC entity. It's not a Southern Baptist Conservative of Virginia entity. They just work together. That's it. But he was listed as SBC because of that, despite not being SBC. So this is the level of scholarship that the list has. Yet Bruce Frank used it to beat the messengers over the head. Say 400, and that's only 3%. So there's a iceberg.
Yeah.
No, he's wrong about the list. He's wrong about the iceberg. Guidepost used this list to bash the SBC. Again, secular media, Christian media, both sides, whether it's conservative, liberal, have used this list to bash the SBC. So there's something real dirty going on. And thank God it is not it's not an SBC sex abuse crisis. But there is a crisis going on of abuse in the SBC. It just happens to be abuse of power.
Yep. Wow. Well, thank you so much for that that presentation. And you can even leave that up for a second. At the very end of your PowerPoint slide, it says, "Thank you and God bless you. Questions, concerns, just disagree, and want me to know," they can contact you at kyle@wokepedia@gmail.com. Now, for you who are just listening, it's the word woke and pedia, like Wikipedia. So Kyle and it's the word at, not the at symbol, kyle@wokepedia@gmail.com. So definitely email Kyle, maybe say thanks, encourage him for this work and this labor of love, just to help us to really examine the evidence. And so, brother, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think this is a blessing. And for those who are not math nerds like myself, I mean, I was really bad at math in school. So thank you. I greatly appreciate it. But looking through this and hearing it, you could see how this abuse of power that's happening from the platform in the SBC, and for those who have an agenda to restructure the SBC, sounds very, not to just be pejorative, but to be completely honest, it sounds Marxist. It is Marxist. It's a Marxist revolution within the SBC. Yeah. This is one of the means by which they do it.
Yep.
It was race for a while, and now they switch gears to sex abuse.
Yeah.
And gender. And so I'll be curious to see where they go next. But the people in the pew need to see this, and they need to respond. And so, Kyle, how would you kind of close up this time together? How would you say to someone who's heard what you just said, how would you encourage them to move forward? If someone, and maybe you got a few resources to even recommend beyond this, if someone's like, look, I hear what you're saying, Kyle, but I need to be better equipped. What should I go and do as a result of this? What would you say when they find themselves at this crossroad?
So the things that I would say are, first, trust God. Now, again, I went through a lot of journeys recently calling out the North American Missions Board for their false teaching and false practices and the fallout of that. And, some of the other things that I've done in that journey can be very isolating.
Yes.
Especially being up here in the Northwest. It's a very hostile place to biblical Christianity. Full of false Christianity. And even in the SBC churches, it's just rampant up here. And I went through, kind of an Elijah moment where woe is me, I'm the only one left type thing. And God smacked me around pretty good and made it clear that there is a remnant and that he's taking care of them, and that he can do what he wills, whether to turn the SBC around, turn Christianity around in this country, turn the country around, or whether it's to save those last few in this country before it completely is given over to evil. It's his. So I trust him. My encouragement is don't go through that self-pity moment. You don't have to.
Yeah.
Understand that there is that remnant. What are you listening to right now? You're listening to part of that remnant. So have faith in God. SBC members, take information like this and go to your pastor and show them what is going on and why it's dangerous. If you're a pastor or if you're that layperson and you got it across to your pastor and now they're seeing the problems, go to your local association and raise the issues there. Get your local association on the right track when it comes to rooting out these errors, when it comes to calling the SBC to account. Go to your state convention, do the same thing, and then go to the SBC itself. The only way things are going to turn around is when you go up the chain. I think one thing that's been just highly discouraging to conservatives is how well the liberals have been playing people at the convention level, at the SBC annual meetings. Go to those grassroots levels and start building up. That's the only way that a true conservative wave, a new resurgence is going to happen. The also wonderful thing about that is you're partnering immediately with people. You're not partnering with people across the country. You're working in your local area, and you will always feel more confident and more fulfilled and more motivated when you're physically partnering with people. It's great to partner people over a distance, but again, virtual church is not church. Virtual partnership is not the same as in-person partnership. So when you do that, you will see much greater strength than you will on your own. That's the encouragement that I would give. One last comment I would give about my presentation for anyone that might be confused. I am not saying these numbers are perfect numbers. I am not saying these numbers are completely accurate numbers. The point of the presentation was to use Bruce Frank's numbers and see how they compare. And it's for comparative purposes, not definitive numbers. I think the numbers are pretty decent. And so I gave you all the reference of why. But don't go, oh, well, I think he's just making that number up. And blah, blah, blah. No. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to compare what Bruce Frank said to his own words and numbers. Does it comport with reality? Or does it not? And it does not. It does not agree with reality. That is where we need to live in reality.
That's good, man. And I think that's a really good word on which we might finish on. And I think that for those moving forward listening to this, I'll have a bunch of links below you want to follow. My hope is that the truth will come out. And this is a big reason why I did this podcast and why I interview guys like you, because you care about the truth. And a lot of these guys who are just company men just care about position, status, power. And look, I know that's a temptation for every man. It is that power is a temptation for every man. And power is not bad. Power is a gift from God. Authority is a gift from God. But when it's abused, as it has been, it's really dangerous for the church. And we've seen that throughout history. We're seeing it again now. And a good example of this, and I could point many of you to other things happening within evangelicalism, and it was referenced to by Kyle a moment ago, is when Tom and Jennifer Buck recently learned that when Bart Barber appointed the sex abuse task force that was going to move forward in implementing some of these things that were recommended, one of the lead people on the task force was Todd Binkert of SBC Voices and a pastor in Indiana. And he is the person who Tom Buck had a phone conversation with, where it was accidentally revealed by Todd who the person was that he was protecting, which was Karen Swallow Pryor. And in that moment, Tom learned a whole lot. He learned that Todd Binkert was lying to him. And Jay Adkins was also connected to this as well. He was partaking in that and has been unwilling to call out his friend. And really, when we look at the situation, I think we see a lot about what's really at play. And it's really about silencing the opposition. Tom Buck has been a faithful man who has stood on the truth of God's word and has been unafraid to challenge the establishment. And, he's like a Ron DeSantis to me, as it relates with an SBC. I appreciate Tom so much. And when you look at what he's done and what he's had to go through, it's horrific that they would take the abuse story of his own wife and spread it around and use it to slander and use it to hurt. And it's not caring well as they keep championing from the platform. We need to care well for these abuse victims, unless they don't hold to our view, then we should, silence their voices. And it's abusive. Todd Binkert is an abuser. He is an abuser. Yep. And he's leading the abuse task force. And, sure, he might have genuinely helped people in the past deal with abuse things. Okay, praise God for that. But does he have integrity? No, he doesn't. He's not repented. And it's sad. So just for my listeners, I wanted you to hear that, especially from me, right from me, but on the heels of what Kyle said. Kyle, thank you so much for your faithfulness. And really, at the end of this podcast, I'd just like to pray for you real quick. Yeah, let me pray for you. God, I thank you so much for Kyle. I thank you for his ministry and his service in this way for the body of Christ, for the universal church, for those who are part of the remnant who want to know the truth. And I pray that you would protect him, you would encourage him, and that, Lord, you would use his work here to help churches see the need for a true return to the book, to the Bible, to your revealed will and word. Lord, help us to love your word, to hate sin in ourselves first, and to even hate the sin in our brothers and to call them out for it. Why? Because if they claim to be brothers, then they need to rightly follow you. So we pray for them, and God asks that you would be glorified in their lives, in our lives, and that you would help us every day as we walk toward heaven, toward glory, as we seek to walk by the Spirit. Bless Kyle, and thank you for this time. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kyle, for coming on the podcast, and you have a wonderful day.
You too, brother. It was exciting to be here, and I hope it was helpful.